All right, hi. Thanks for coming out to learn about Android security. As Eric said, my name is Kristina. I'm a mobile application security engineer at Shopify. And I mostly focus on the Android side of things. We have a pretty small team, and shameless plug, we are hiring. So if you have any interest in mobile AppSec stuff, come talk to me or to Ivan. But we're going to talk about kind of the different attack surfaces for Android applications, as well as how to guard against them, some real world examples, some resources. I'm a big fan of books, so there's going to be some books mentioned at the end, as well as some like random online courses and stuff like that. So a little bit about me. I did a comp sci degree at McGill, then worked as a web and mobile dev at an agency, joined Shopify in 2016 as a general engineer working primarily with Ruby on Rails, and then switched over to security and have never been happier. So this is what we're going to talk about. The Android basic stuff will probably be very familiar to most of you, but we're just going to run through quickly different application components because they're going to come up a bit. Actually, they're going to come up a lot later on in the talk. We're going to talk very briefly about the Android ecosystem and how it kind of makes things a little bit more vulnerable than some other ecosystems and operating systems. We're going to talk about common attack surfaces and then common vulnerabilities and how we avoid them. And then, as I said, tools and resources and continued learning opportunities. So, Android basics. I really like GIFs or GIFs, if you prefer. So bear with me because I'm probably going to laugh at most of them because they're just ridiculous. Okay, so Android basics. So you might have heard Android described as basically Java on Linux. That's kind of true. Android gets kind of a bad rap, right, for being really insecure, but from a security standpoint, it's actually built pretty beautifully. It's just, as we'll see, kind of like the ecosystem that sort of messes things up. So again, you probably already know this, but Android applications in the framework execute within the Dalvik virtual machine, and that provides a nice abstraction layer to the operating system so that applications can't do too terrible of things with like the main operating system. Security boundaries, that is used to divide areas with certain levels of trust. So for example, there's a kernel space that's divided from the user space. The code in the kernel space is trusted to perform kind of like low-level operations in the hardware and access all the virtual and physical memory and all that fun stuff that attackers would love to access. But security boundaries prevent the user space from having access to that, which makes it a lot more difficult when someone hijacks an app or device to actually do anything too terrible. Then we have two different permissions models in the Android world. You have the Linux kernel. That's very similar to anybody, if you've worked with a Linux operating system, it's the same kind of permissions model with users and groups that enforce permissions. And this is what we kind of refer to as the sandbox that keeps applications sort of separate from each other and makes it a little bit less scary when building applications because they're basically limited to their own data for the most part. So it limits what you can access or what resources you can access and who can access those resources. And then we have the Android runtime permissions model, which just defines app permissions. And that's the fun stuff you would describe or define in your Android manifest XML file. Application components, I'm just going to run through these again very quickly. Our activity, single focused, user interface based, intents used to start an activity or a service, and you can broadcast and receive them within the application with other applications. There's implicit and explicit. Explicit is typically routed to a single app, whereas implicit is routed to any app that shows some sort of interest in receiving the intents of that certain form that it's built in. And we'll see why implicit versus explicit matters later on, because there are some fun vulnerabilities built into implicit intents. Broadcast receivers, they're an inter-process communication endpoint and used for apps to specify they want to receive an implicit intent. They also are a playground for hackers. Services, background operations, content providers, storing data, allowing applications to exchange data, also very fun for hacking. Webview acts like a web browser, like a web view. Permissions. So we're going to talk about a couple different types of permissions: file permissions, custom permissions, application permissions. And they're basically determining what your application can do or cannot do, and what other applications can do or cannot do, and they are very important. And then finally, the manifest file with all your information about the app. So for those of you who knew all that, I'm really sorry. But it's kind of important for a lot of the rest of the talk for anybody who maybe didn't know. Oh my gosh, I love this GIF so much. It's so ridiculous. Illuminati hacked banks. Anyways. Okay, so why is Android so vulnerable? I mean, it's built very nicely. The whole idea of a sandbox is this beautiful idea where applications can't touch each other's stuff. But one big issue is this whole idea of fragmentation. So we love that Android's open sourced, right? But that makes it really easy for mobile device manufacturers to build their own Android flavor and make, a bajillion devices that you have to learn to support. So with so many devices, you have different hardware configurations, and then you have different API levels and different screen sizes and peripheral availability, and then certain devices that have not been updated since like 2012. And as developers, I'm sure you have shaken your fist at having to deal with all of these issues. But it's kind of like a pro-con situation. So on one side, the pro is that attackers might find an issue or an exploit on one particular flavor of Android, like something on a Samsung phone. But they're not likely to be able to exploit that particular vulnerability in exactly the same way across all devices. So that kind of makes it a little bit easier for us because we're not worried about, somebody finding one vulnerability somewhere and then all of a sudden it impacts every single device on the market. The problem for security researchers is that a comprehensive audit is pretty much impossible because you would have to look at all the software running on every device. And I don't think we could do that in our lifetime. So the next issue we have is update frequency. And new versions are adopted really slowly to the point where in 2013, the ACLU actually filed a complaint against the biggest 4 major mobile carriers with the FTC because they said they're really not helping users update their phones enough and it's dangerous. Backporting, or lack thereof. There's pretty much no backporting for security fixes for older Android versions. It's kind of frightening. Android Update Alliance, or lack thereof. So in 2011, none of those dates, during Google I/O, they announced this beautiful initiative to encourage all partners to commit to updating their devices for at least 18 months after their initial release. And it was including HTC, LG, Samsung, Motorola, Sony, Ericsson, everybody big, basically, in the mobile device game. And then it was never mentioned again. Literally nothing happened with it. And it turns out it just wasn't commercially viable for a lot of these companies to support devices that maybe didn't sell so well. They didn't want to put the money in it. So that's unfortunate. Updating dependencies for open source projects is really time consuming and cumbersome and just hard to do. Open source doesn't necessarily mean it's secure, right? In some ways, the open source environment is beautiful because you can have people that have access to the code who can audit it themselves and say, hey, this is not built particularly well. But at the same time, it means that vendors can modify Android and like I said, make their own kind of flavor of it and introduce vulnerabilities. And that, bugs equal vulnerabilities, and vendors aren't always the best at building things. And then public disclosures, or lack thereof. Disclosures are super rare. Again, in 2008, Android Security Announce was a mailing list that Google came out with, and it has a single post. And so that really didn't go anywhere. And tracking issues through changelogs and other sources is really time consuming, and there's just not really a consolidated database, I guess, of vulnerability issues. And that's probably for a couple of reasons. It's not really in Google's best interest to list all of the flaws in their manufacturing partners' devices. And then on top of that, if they haven't been patched, then all of a sudden you've got a database of vulnerabilities that, if you're a hacker, you can be like, well, HTC hasn't done anything with this, and now I can exploit it. So it kind of makes sense. It's just unfortunate. All right, so we're going to talk about common attack surfaces. There's a lot. Permissions, broadcast receivers, IPCs, storage, intents, web views, content providers, logging, data validation, obfuscation, tampering, There's a lot, and this is actually just a subset. These are the common ones, which is a little terrifying. But thankfully, there is progressively becoming more information on how to deal with them. I think mobile security is still kind of this new world of, I mean, security in general was sort of one of those things you deal with like later, right? Like we have a timeline. We'll like audit this after the fact because we have to get this done by this date. And now, you know, with all of these new exploits that have been, you know, released in the news and people are actually starting to care, more people are coming forward and more research is being done. So it's going to be a bit easier to kind of deal with a lot of this. So what are these common vulnerabilities based on these attack surfaces, and how do we deal with them? I love this GIF too. Hackers in the mainframe. All right, so permissions. This one I'm going to kind of go through quickly because the gist of it is don't give people too many permissions. Developers often ask for more permissions than they need, and that's just a kind of across the board thing. It's commonplace. So if you do it, don't feel bad. And most users accept anything, right? Like I've done it myself where something pops up and it's like, we need to access this, this, and this. And you're like, all right, have all my things. But you have to kind of remember as well that whatever application you're building, you can trust your application. You can know that you are not building malware, but you don't actually know what your user is going to have on their phone, whether it's rooted, whether they like side-loaded a bunch of sketchy apps from some third-party marketplace. So it's best to err on the side of caution and just do whatever you can to make the attack surface smaller, which typically means following what's called the principle of least privilege. It's also called the principle of minimal privilege or least authority, and it's basically not allowing certain processes or users or programs or whatever you're dealing with to have more permissions than they need. It's a very important, I guess, like tenet of security that if you don't have to give something a permission, don't give it a permission. If you need read permissions, don't give read-write permissions, just give the read permissions, and that tends to be a bit safer. So file permissions, and this really just applies for files that are stored externally. We'll talk about secure files or secure storage in general in a little bit. But if you're storing something, for example, in like an SD card, that's accessible by everyone, other applications, if you don't have file permissions set. So you can define them in the manifest and the code. So if you're auditing an application, it's a good idea to check both places because sometimes, if you have multiple developers too, maybe somebody can set something in the manifest and then in the code it's just like, have everything. Malware loves SD cards. Like a lot of malware will just go like directly to SD cards and be like, what have you not protected? Let me grab it all. If you're using open file output, the good thing about that is that your files are actually private to the application, so you don't have to worry about any of this. So what to do? Don't give mode world readable or mode world writable permissions if you can help it, because they allow other applications to access the file, especially if it's on like your SD card. And then if you share files with a content provider, that's just a safer way to share things, and you're avoiding the external storage altogether. Okay, so IPCs, inter-process communications. Their abuse cases are kind of dependent on their purpose. So protection is typically associated with permissions. So you're going to hear me say a lot of the time today, give it a permission. And that's basically why. So endpoints for IPCs aren't always secured like they should be. And we're going to look at services, activities, broadcast receivers, content providers. Those tend to be the big ones that are targeted by attackers. And because they act as data sinks and data storages, they are a really great place for potential attacks to retrieve data or to, inject something. So, for example, an application could define an IPC endpoint that should be accessible only by other components in that application or by applications that request the permission required to interact with them, but that's not always the case. So broadcast messages, for example, allow any application to receive a broadcast intent, and then malicious apps could basically gain access to another application's data, or like whatever was being used or whatever was being broadcast, essentially, if there's not a permission associated with it. Content providers are loads of fun because they, with sharing data, depending on how the data is actually being stored, you could expose access to that data. You can expose the entire directory structure that can lead to a directory traversal attack. SQL injection attacks, those are super fun when you have SQLite files. And then when they're not permissions protected, any application can invoke your content provider. That's kind of scary. Activities. Activities could be used for a UI redressing attack. I had never actually heard the term UI redressing. It's also known as clickjacking. And the idea is basically, let's say you're a visitor on a site and you know that typically you would press the little X button to close your window. When you're redressing the UI, that little button all of a sudden doesn't close the window. It actually downloads some sort of virus or turns on your microphone or webcam or something like that. So it's possible to do that through activities that are not protected. Broadcast receivers also could be hijacked to intercept an intent and all of its data. You can also actually run a denial of service attack through broadcast receivers just by passing a null value, because a lot of the time data validation isn't necessarily thought of. You see that less so, but still a fair bit. And then finally, services could expose application-specific functionality, but they're a little bit less fun. So here's a fun real-world example that kind of blew my mind. You remember the Galaxy S3? So I don't know how to pronounce this app name, but it's something like Keys? Keys? Thank you. So Keys was super privileged, and it had a broadcast receiver that basically restored APKs from an external SD card. And a researcher was able to add their, it could be malicious. It wasn't actually. They were just testing this out. But they were able to add their own app to this SD card directory. It was SD card restore. And they were able to do that by exploiting this write external storage privilege issue, which was a vulnerability in the clipboard service on the S3. And then they used Keys to call a chain of different intents that iterated through every application stored on the restore directory and installed every single one of those APKs and gave it all the permissions of Keys. So kind of terrifying. So how do you prevent this kind of thing? So again, we've talked about sharing files using content provider and avoiding external storage where you can. But the thing is, when you're using content providers, you need to make sure that, I'm going to say it a lot, you set a permission for the required application. And then also make sure you're sanitizing your inputs so that you don't have issues with SQL injection attacks. If you can, use explicit intents wherever possible, because then you don't have to worry about those intents being hijacked by another application, like you would with an implicit intent. Use custom permissions with services. Again, permissions, because they can be checked by the service when the external service makes a request. Use the local broadcast manager if you're dealing with local intents, because no other application can access that data. And so that makes it a lot less stressful, I would assume. And then you have send broadcast and send sticky broadcast. These are susceptible to IPC sniffing. So if you're using this kind of thing, just, again, sign them with permissions. Sign your intents with permissions so that an unauthorized app can't receive the intent. And then check the data that's being received from any broadcast to ensure it's valid. It's just basic data sanitization. That's pretty important in all areas of security, but especially here. So insecure storage. Apps are super easy to reverse engineer. So APKs, and I didn't know this for the longest time, but APKs are basically like zip files. And you can pretty much access anything that's stored in an APK. You can also decompile the code to be readable Java as well. That's pretty easy. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on as well with obfuscation. But when it comes to storage, your data should really be in two different places. We've talked about the SD card, it's accessible by everybody, and then this data package directory that's only accessible to the application. However, if you have a rooted phone, it can also access your data there. And of course, if you give another application permission to that directory, then it can access that too. I think it's important to remember that, and we're going to see some examples of this, but rooted devices can do a whole lot of things. And theoretically, if you didn't have any rooted devices in the world, that would be totally fine, and you could store all the things that you wanted to in there. But we've seen examples where, big apps like Skype store other people's information within a directory in their APK file. And I don't know if they just assumed other people couldn't see it, but it ends badly. So the other issue with insecure storage is that you can actually dump process information if somebody has physical access to the phone. And a lot of the times, process information can be quite sensitive. So that's something to keep in mind, just making sure that Whatever's stored in memory is cleared out, or at least not stored in plain text. And web views also allow the HTML to cache local data. And again, really only an issue if, well, depending on what you're caching, but especially an issue if someone has access to a device, and even if you're just caching information specific to that user. If their phone's stolen, then who knows what they could get. So here's the Skype example. They created SQLite databases and XML files with world-readable and writable permissions. Nothing was encrypted, and it included configuration data and people's message logs, not just the person who owned the device, like everybody's message logs. So that was unfortunate, but kudos to Just In Case for finding that. So how do we handle this? If you're looking at your own apps, try to look for code that stores data locally and make sure it's not storing sensitive data. It's kind of easy to overlook these things, especially in logging, which we'll talk about in a little while. Basically, try to make sure that any sensitive data is never in plain text, because it's pretty easy to grab. And then when you're encrypting, make sure you use a strong encryption algorithm. So no SHA-1, no MD5. If you're encrypting passwords, use something like bcrypt maybe. And avoiding hashing for password storage as well. So if you're using web views, look at the clear cache method, or just don't cache stuff if you don't have to. And that really just saves you from a whole lot of hassle with potentially sensitive information cached through your web view. And then the application class should also be reinitialized with dummy values whenever it loads, because it actually saves information even when the application's closed, and it can be accessed by other classes within the application. Web views are fun. So web views are one of those things where there are a lot of vulnerable applications out in the Google Play market because they're basically just mobile apps wrapped in a web view. And as you probably know, they render web pages inside a browser, and that actually allows applications to add JavaScript and a whole bunch of other stuff. You can break out of the app sandbox and bypass the same origin principle. And if you are accessing a malicious site or malicious web page from your web view, that web view can actually interact with your application and your device with all of the same permissions that your application has. It can call JavaScript and it can call Java. We've seen some updates with, it's like API 17 and later, where you actually have to specify that you're going to be accessing JavaScript with your web view, and that makes it well, we're going to see it in the next slide, but it basically makes it possible that a malicious site can actually use lower level operating system functions. So good job, Google. And you see this a lot with apps that have advertisements. And a lot of the times because they're calling these advertisements from like kind of sketchy places. How often does this happen? Stanford did a really fun study in 2013, and if you have an interest in learning more about this, I definitely recommend looking it up. They looked at more than 40,000 apps, but 40,000 apps had enough public information to show that they were using a JavaScript bridge, which is basically this idea of a web view accessing a web page and being able to pass JavaScript code and like objects between them. A third of those apps could be reached by an untrusted web page or untrusted content. So hopefully it's gotten better, but probably not. Okay, so what do we do to prevent this? I think a big thing is actually restricting users to the application domain. So if you're accessing, some sort of content that's outside of your application and it's on your web server somewhere, making sure that the user can't access content other than that particular domain is really important, because then they just can't stumble across anything too sketchy. Also, the function set JavaScript enabled. It's best to wait to call that until you're actually just about to process JavaScript. And that way, you don't have to worry about something else calling JavaScript before you're ready to. And then here's what I mentioned about the JavaScript interface call for any method being exposed, preventing lower level operating system commands. And another really good way to prevent malicious content from accessing your application through this bridge is creating a whitelist of domains. So if you're using content, third-party content, for example, and you know it's going to be only a small subset of third-party providers, maybe just create a little whitelist that says you can't actually access content outside of these guys, because that's just kind of a nice safety net around your application. And then also sending traffic over SSL. That'll just prevent man-in-the-middle attacks or someone trying to inject script by kind of like sniffing whatever it is that you're sending through your Webview. Logging. Another really fun real-world example we're going to see with Firefox. So I personally love logging as a former developer, still kind of developer, because it's so great for debugging. But there are so many cases where just excessive debugging has leaked sensitive information within applications. Even your system processes, so like Activity Manager, will log detailed messages about the activities that are being run. And Android was updated so that you can't actually read the logs permission with third-party applications after 4.1, but again, remember, rooted devices can pretty much do everything. So you can still access that if a device is rooted. So let's say you have an application that somebody with a rooted device who decides they're going to be a hacker, and they've installed your application in their device, and you were testing at one point whether the login credentials for your application was actually being sent properly. But your login credentials weren't encrypted, and that log was still somewhere existing in your log file. They would be able to access that. And if you have a username stored along with that password, then they could probably, exploit that person's account. So Firefox, fun example, they were logging browser activity, and this was all in plain text URLs along with the session IDs. So you were going to be able to see what URL somebody was accessing along with what their session was while they were accessing that website. And it basically meant that if you had a malicious application or if you yourself were looking at the log files, you could just use that session ID and be like, someone's on Google or Gmail, let's just use their session ID and try to access their email. So basically be careful when you're logging. Obfuscation. So again, we've talked about how easy it is to reverse engineer Android apps, but you can actually make it harder. Some of you have probably heard of ProGuard. It obfuscates your code through what they call lexical obfuscation, which basically means it takes meaningful names and swaps them out and gives you like random computer garbage that doesn't really make sense to anybody. It's not a foolproof way to protect your application from being reverse engineered, but it just makes a hacker's life much more difficult, because trust me, I have been there and cursed the developer who knew about ProGuard. The problem with obfuscation is depending on how you're obfuscating, like ProGuard, you don't really add any real maintenance challenges. But if you're doing like crazy calling methods from within classes that don't actually have anything to do with that, like if you make your code almost unreadable, then maintaining your code, even though it's probably less readable to an attacker, it's just hard to maintain, right? So that's kind of like the cost for making it difficult for other people to read your code, is that in turn it makes it harder for you to read your code. Native code makes decompilation harder. So when you're decompiling an APK, you typically get this sort of like Java-looking code. What basically happens is it gets converted into something called Smalley, and then onto this like Java, basically. But if you're using native code, so like lower level, like C calls, for example, like a native library, then the attacker has to reverse engineer your application and then start reading through assembly, which, if you've dealt with assembly versus Java, it's really not fun. But the problem is, if you're using native code as well, then you're more susceptible to any potential attacks or any potential issues or vulnerabilities that lower level languages have, like buffer overflows and issues with string formatting and stuff like that you find in C. And then finally, Java reflection. So Java reflection is basically you're using code that's able to inspect other code and not and it makes it harder to trace what's happening in your app. But again, can sometimes make it a little bit difficult for anybody else reading your application who's not trying to reverse engineer it. So private keys. This is probably my favorite thing to talk about. I was at B-Sides San Francisco in April, and there was a really fantastic talk that I'm going to reference in the next slide, but it was just basically talking about the number of private keys that are found in applications. And private keys are super important because they basically allow you to sign your apps in a way that other people cannot pretend to be you. And then they're also used for encrypting HTTPS traffic. But they're in private apps all the time. And I didn't realize this for the longest time until I saw this guy's presentation. And people put private keys in the Java key store as well. So if you haven't used the Java key store, it's a container for public and private keys and certificates. Password protection is actually optional, so not ideal. There's no container level encryption, also not ideal. And the private keys that are in the Java key store share the same password as the key store container if you do have a password. So not the best protection, really, and we're going to see why in a couple slides. The other problem is that people are really bad with passwords, and you can't really trust a password to protect any sensitive information that you're including in your APK or your application in general. So this is the talk I was going to mention. Will Dorman, he works at Carnegie Mellon, and in June 2017, he saw a tweet from an IT security journalist that found a private key in a Cisco app. And he thought, okay, let's see how many other apps also have private keys. So he pulled down a ridiculous number of applications, like 1.7 million APKs. And he talked a fair bit about how difficult it was to kind of like, he had everything in SQLite files and like basically parsing it all and all the regex that required and what a nightmare it was. But thankfully for us, he stuck with it because these were all of the numbers of different private keys that were stored in these applications. Now, in 1.7 million, that's like, it's a relatively small number of private keys found, but like still pretty significant that you can take multiple applications and modify them and re-sign them as that developer and then re-upload them, and it'll seem like nothing happened. So if we look at the next slide, we kind of goes into a bit more detail about this. The private keys that were found, over 6,000. Unprotected, 650, so like not terrible. Some people were still protecting them. Keys for certificates, Google Play signing private keys, almost 2,000, which is horrifying. Apple push services, private keys. People were including like Apple keys in their apps. And then he also talked about, so you had people who were including private keys that were still password protected. This example is just for PKCS 12, and it's used to store private keys with an accompanying public key certificate, and it's protected with a password-based symmetric key. But he was actually able to break a lot of these. So the rocku.txt is just a password list of common passwords, and he applied this to the just a little over 2,000 private keys that he found that were using this particular implementation. And he was able to break 41.4% of them. And strings from app code was also able to just find like random strings that were the passwords for these private keys. And then manual analysis of just like digging through the application, and like some people would hide them in like weird file names that were kind of sneaky, and he was like, this is impressive, but like you're still hiding your private key in your application. And then the Java key store password cracking stats were also kind of scary. I mean, less so because the rocku password list really only broke about 14%. But then there were strings in the app code that were related to the passwords. Again, only 1%. Not terrible, but not great. And then hashcat naive, 53.3%. So I just really enjoyed that talk. It was kind of eye-opening because I just didn't really understand that it was something that would happen very often. And if you want to watch it, that's the link. You can also do a search for B-Sides SF Will Dorman, and you'll see it there. So what to do with private keys? Basically, don't store your private keys in your app is the message I'm trying to drive home. If you need somewhere to store them, Google came out with the key management service, KMS service, I think it is. And it's cloud storage for your secrets. If you don't trust Google, then you could store them somewhere else, but just like not in the app, please. So now tamper detection. And we've talked about how easy it is to reverse an APK, and we're going to look at a couple of tools that people use to do that. If somebody downloads an APK and then modifies it and re-signs it, the certificate is still going to change because unless they have your private key, they're going to be a different person. But you can still re-upload an app to some sort of store and act as though it is, a totally harmless Google product. And you see that a lot with malware, where it's like, this is Google free, as opposed to the Google you paid for. Like, it's not really a thing. But you can actually add signature checks to your code, and you just have to be really sneaky about it. It's not foolproof, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you could basically add checks within your application that just says, hey, is this my signature? Yes, no? Cool. But you have to kind of hide it someplace that an attacker may not know to look, because they could just figure out where it is and just remove it. Okay, so what to do? We've talked about adding in special checks to your code. Kind of avoid doing that from the client side. If you just add in like straight up code that doesn't use any sort of server check and just says, is this my signature? And my signature is stored somewhere in the application, it's pretty easy to get around that. Google Safety Net is a pretty amazing set of APIs, and they do a lot of tamper protection, nifty stuff. So they can detect whether a device is rooted. I mean, it's not perfect, but they can detect, for the most part, whether it's rooted. And then also whether a device even has malware on it from a certain list of known malware types. And they also allow server-side checking for application tampering. So, I mean, that could be stripped out too if a hacker really knows what they're doing, but it's a lot easier than just like your straight-up Java code that is called like, my signature check. And then also, Android debug bridge. A lot of hackers will, when they're reversing an Android application, will use that to try to basically get into your application as though you're in debug mode. It's a good way to kind of get around some permissions that like you might not have through a released version of your application. So you can actually set up system calls to check whether the application is being run through ADB, and if it is, you can just like lock it down. So the main takeaway here is be paranoid all the time. I'm sort of kidding, but like basically assume that if people can do bad things with your application, they're going to do bad things with your application. Basic sort of hygiene rules for app security with Android: never ever trust the client, and this basically goes for any security, iOS security, PC security, web security. Never trust the client. Just assume that everyone who's using your app is a horrible person, and then you'll be fine. Follow the principle of least privilege that we've talked about, so only give permissions when they're necessary. There's actually a security linter in Android Studio, if you didn't know about it. It's pretty handy. It just basically flags random security things that are very obvious that you should maybe keep an eye on. Never store your private key in the app. If there's one thing you take away from this today, it is please never store your private key in the app. And then be as explicit as possible about your app's intentions. So whether that's using explicit intents rather than implicit whenever you can, or explicit permissions, it really narrows the attack surface. And then, yeah, seriously, never trust the client. All right, tools and resources. These are 3 of my favorite, basically reversing or like security auditing tools. Drozer, if anybody here is running, building on a Mac operating system, full disclosure, Drozer is not fun on Mac at all, like painful. I run it in a VirtualBox Kali Linux VM, and that's a lot better. It's just like there are so many different dependencies, and if you have certain dependencies that like the code from your company, for example, requires, then you can like uninstall weird versions, and it's just horrible. So good luck if you decide to do it. Let me know how it goes, because I gave up. But it basically lets you assume the role of an Android app so you can interact with other apps and basically see what your app is able, or what permissions other applications are able to take advantage of on your application. And it spits out this really beautiful little report that says, hey, all these things are wrong with your app, go fix them. It's kind of disheartening, but also very handy and mostly automated. APK tool is really handy for reversing Android apps, so you can decode your resources, basically to what they would exactly look like before they were packaged up and put on the marketplace or app store or whatever. And yeah, I mean, APK tool says it makes working with an app easier because the project-like file structure and automation of some repetitive tasks, which is true, actually. That's legitimate. And then JADEX, I don't know how to say it. It's a command line and GUI interface, and it basically decompiles your APK into this really nice Java-readable structure. And I use these frequently, like we do on our team, and they're wonderful. Resources. These are some really wonderful, free, just web-based resources. You've probably looked at, the Android, developer.android.com site. They have really great best practices list for security for Android development, as well as a really nifty security overview that's easy to read through. And then OWASP is great. They also have a meetup in Toronto, which is amazing. And they used to have something called the Android testing cheat sheet or Android security testing cheat sheet. That's actually been replaced with this mobile security testing guide that's very extensive. It covers iOS and Android, and it's being made into a book now. You can actually get a free version of the ebook, or you can pay $15 if you want to support their initiative. And it's updated regularly. So, you know, it's a really good resource to kind of just do a sanity check with your team, with the app that you're building, kind of just like run through their little checklist and be like, have I covered all these things? Have I thought about them at least? Then you're good to go. So finally, continued learning. Yeah, I like this GIF too, although the video is bizarre. So books. I've mentioned I really like books and online learning resources. If there was one book I had to recommend, it would probably be the Android Hacker's Handbook. It goes very in-depth into other ways that you can attack Android devices, like hardware attacks, as well as like kernel attacks and stuff like that. But it has a really nice section on application security in general. And they do trainings based on this handbook at different conferences, security conferences around, I'm pretty sure the world, but definitely North America. The Android Security Internals book is quite good, but it's like very not hardware, but like very low level and hardware based. It's not as specific to like how you should build your applications. It's more like, how is Android built from the bottom up? And let's understand absolutely everything about how Android is made. So, you know, good to know and helps with your security knowledge, but not as focused on the whole application part of things. Android Application Security Essentials and Securing Android Studio Applications, both really good resources as well. And there are ebook versions on the internet for like $13, which is quite nice. That blue book, the early access one, is the OWASP Mobile Security Testing Guide. And then for videos, lynda.com, I guess, is now called LinkedIn Learning, but lynda.com, I'll just keep calling it that because solidarity with, I don't know, the startup, I don't know. They have some really great resources for mobile security testing and application development in general. And then same with Udemy and Cybrary. Cybrary is very specific to cybersecurity stuff. There's less mobile AppSec learning in there, but there's still a bit. I think there's one course that's kind of cool. And then courses. If you actually want to go learn, you know, basically everything you possibly can about mobile security, there are some great online resources. This Stanford Continuing Studies program is an option. So Stanford offers basically continuing education for professionals online. I've done the program, and so has Ivan on my team sitting back there. And their mobile security discussion is actually pretty extensive. They're not cheap, especially because it's in American dollars. They're like $600 American. But they do have a lot of really great information. So especially if your organization has an education reimbursement plan, that's a good thing to look at. SANS is a leader in cybersecurity training, and they do a lot of mobile security stuff, mobile security trainings, either online, sometimes at certain conferences, they'll have like in real life trainings. Those make the Stanford program look like incredibly cheap. We're talking like $4,000 for a 4-day training thing with SANS. So it is expensive, but they're kind of the leaders in cybersecurity training. And then coming up in, I guess, August, Black Hat is a big security conference, and they're actually doing a lot of Android and iOS security testing workshops. And again, these are like multiple days of training from people who literally wrote the books I just showed you. So not cheap, but really, really great resources. And a lot of this you can actually find online too. And that's it. Thanks so much for coming out to listen. I guess if there's any questions too, you can ask me questions. Cool, pizza. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that.
Can you talk about some use cases where that would come up when the web views don't enable it to
I'm trying to think of something off the top of my head, but oh yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah. So the question was basically the set JavaScript enabled call. Basically, setting that just when you really need it. What would be an example of when you would do that? When you would, is that right? When you would just set it right when you would really need it? I can't think of like a concrete example, but and if somebody here has a better example, please like pipe up. The thing that comes to mind for me is like basically anytime you're accessing anything that might have JavaScript from a third party, like whenever that particular content is being called, like calling that method literally right before you have to call that next content. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm trying to think of, I haven't actually seen it done before. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Sorry, did you say that was a page that you know, like that you value? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Then that would be. Right. Okay, yeah. So I think an example of that would be, let's say, like I have seen applications that load third-party content from, like in their Webview, that is on some website that they didn't make. And you would have to basically trust that, like, let's say you're loading a web page that has, I don't know, let's say an ad or something like that, that if you have set JavaScript enabled and you're loading that content and then you don't really know what other content is being run in that particular page, that's an example of when things could get a little bit dicey. I mean, if you know what the page is or like the content is that you're loading, I think it's like pretty fine. Sorry, what were you going to say? That's a great, yeah. That's a great example. Yeah, so just to repeat for people on the internets. Facebook Messenger, when you open a link, it opens within the app, and same with Reddit. So, yeah. Sorry, Chrome tabs? I haven't actually done a lot with custom Chrome tabs, to be honest. Has anybody here?
It's like a lot more secure that way.
Yeah? Okay, cool. So custom Chrome tabs. Good to know. Thank you.
But you're a lot more limited in the back and forth of Chrome tab. Like the Chrome tab can have their app. Like it can't just like run a function the same way that it can with Webview.
Oh, okay, cool. So yeah, just to repeat that. So Chrome tabs, custom Chrome tabs can't interact with your application the same way that you could in a web view, right? Okay, cool. That's great. Thank you.
Do you think the hybrid apps are same way vulnerable as native apps?
Hybrid as in apps that are like native Android code and then like busting out into like a web view type of thing?
Hybrid like are using full stack or something?
Sorry, I can't hear.
Like hybrid as in they are working both in iOS and Android.
Oh.
Like if Flutter.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah, that's so. And sorry, are you talking about applications as well that are built with like some sort of service that allows you to deploy in both Android and iOS? Is that what you mean? Yeah. So there was a slide, I didn't include it on here, but I wouldn't necessarily trust those. And again, this is me being exceptionally paranoid. But in the talk I was mentioning with the private keys being embedded in apps, this guy actually reached out to a lot of app developers and was like, hey, I found your app and it has a private key in it. And most of the messages he got back were people like swearing at him. But one person replied and they were like, oh, that was just because I used this third-party service that was embedding the private key. So I think it's a great idea. Like, it's really nice not to have two separate teams of developers or needing to necessarily deploy, two totally different applications. But my advice would just be to audit them. Like, if you're going to deploy them, maybe reverse engineer them yourself and just make sure there's nothing particularly sketchy going on from whatever that third-party company has done.
Just to clarify what you were asking about, Flutter actually is native code. It's not like there's something that you're talking about. Flutter actually are putting native code for each platform. So it's not quite the same thing as
Oh, okay, cool.
as the cross-compiled apps,
Mhm.
which are definitely a little bit more risky.
Okay, good to know. So yeah, Flutter uses native code. So sweet.
What would you recommend for a self-taught 22-year-old, maybe there's a couple others in the audience, that has Android app in the App Store and other coding skills, iOS skills, etc., pretty intense. What would you recommend to get this guy busted into the industry that he would be actually hired for?
Within security or within like development?
Development in general.
Well, I've never actually, like, we do interviews for security people, but I don't know if it's the same kind of thing that people are looking for with like general application developers. My advice I always give people, especially young people that that talk to me that are like coming out of school or boot camp or self-taught or whatever, is just like build as much as you can as well as you can and show that you have a really good passion for learning and that you care about code quality. I mean, I don't know, Eric, you might be able to talk more to this. I don't know if, because you've done hiring stuff, but.
I do it. Actually, we could host like meetup. We could chat about it. But yeah, I look for the same things, like the ability to learn. Android, iOS mobile development changes every 3 months, every 6 months. Like all the bombshells that Google dropped at I/O 2018, like kind of changes so much for Android developers. It's always changing, and just the ability to kind of pick up new skills and to keep up and to sort of adapt to stuff that you learned, and also having sort of the ownership, which is related to sort of code quality, right? Like that you care about the code that you wrote and that you were trying to make it.
Sure, that makes sense. But like, how do you like show yourself to the world? Here I am, and you want to hire me type of thing.
GitHub? GitHub?
GitHub, yeah, and you can GitHub huge, like, right? But like, how does somebody in the world present himself? You say, hey, here I am.
Something that we see a lot of as well is like having a presence, like some sort of online presence, whether you're on Twitter, or you write a blog, you do tutorials or give talks or whatever. Just basically something that shows that you're present in the industry and you're passionate enough to spend time outside of your necessary job doing that. Mm-hmm.
We actually had a talk last year on just this topic. So if you look through the archives on the YouTube channel for the Toronto Android developers, we actually have some previous talks on it, which are actually really good.
Sorry, I think I saw your hand first.
So on your slide about the Android system, how it's constructed, you had Dalvik in there.
Mm-hmm.
Since 5.0 or so, there's Art now replacing Dalvik. I'm wondering if that has any security implications that you know about, and if you still target versions of Android that are running Dalvik or not.
Yeah. So nothing like basically all the same security principles still apply. There's nothing that's really popped out that has been particularly different, which is kind of nice. I believe we do still support Dalvik VM versions of Android, right?
The current version of Android uses Dalvik still for just packet compilation before
Right, yeah.
Art finishes compiling, so you can run that straight away instead of waiting for it to install.
I was just going to add part of the issues that they had is that Dalvik was a, I did part presentation I did. It was like a different implementation of Java. It wasn't your actual OpenJDK implementation, so that's why Sun and Apache Kernel got shut down. Then it was the coding farm. So yes.
Mhm.
Traditionally, they didn't check against null, for example. So a beginning developer kind of going through the steps might not do that.
Yeah.
I was wondering, has Google like explicitly made more of an effort to actually try to combat some? Because the linter is like a really good, more obvious thing that people just like one day just kind of popped up. You know?
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. There's actually, I think a lot of the vulnerabilities we even see being introduced, it's because there tends to be some discrepancies in documentation that you see and what the code actually does, like even around certain permissions. I think progressively everybody is trying to focus more on security. I think for the longest time, the industry was very, develop first, deal with security later. And I mean, I've seen it not just for Google and, making updates to their documentation and offering things like their security overview, pretty extensive documentation that I linked in a couple slides back from this. I think everybody's kind of taking that approach because now they're realizing, okay, this can't be an afterthought. I do think it makes it really difficult for beginner developers. It's something that really frustrates me. Like, I didn't have any exposure to security related things until I like actively sought it out through books and on like certifications and random stuff like that. So I think, yeah, that's a really, really good point. I think it's changing, but very slowly because people tend not to care about documentation. Mm-hmm.
That is actually like a good thing for industry security across the board, and that's Steve can back me up on this, like, because I think feel like he might know more about it than I do. But Google, I guess, like either hinted at or like maybe like not explicitly said, but they mentioned that like OEMs are going to be held to higher monthly security update standards now, where they're
Mm-hmm.
going to be written into their contracts.
Yeah, I heard that too, and that seems really promising.
It's huge, right?
Yeah, because it's one of like when we talk about why are things so vulnerable, you can't necessarily rely on OEMs to do something that might not really make them money. Sorry guys, I don't know why I looked up, but yeah, no, that's a really good point, and I hope it sticks. Like I hope that if OEMs don't abide by what's in their contract, I hope that someone like brings the hammer down so it's not like another alliance situation.
Yeah, essentially trying to use the CTS to actually enforce the compliance.
Oh, okay, cool,
For security patches at least, not necessarily for version updates.
nice, amazing.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed. Cool. Yep.
For someone that might be interested in specializing in mobile security, could you speak a little more about like the day-to-day?
Yeah, for sure. So our responsibility is kind of trifold, I guess. Part of it is we build out applications or like features, I guess, within Shopify products that rely on security. We also audit other people's products. Like, so how do I phrase this? So we deal with applications that come not just from Shopify, Android or iOS mobile developers. We also deal with third-party applications. So I don't know if anybody saw what happened with the RSA event application where they had a hard-coded private key credential situation with their third-party app they were using. But it's really fun. You should read about it. When I say fun, I really mean scary. But anyways, we audit third-party apps before we allow other people on our teams to use them to make sure that they're not doing anything that might impact Shopify's, the trust between Shopify and our merchants or our third-party app developers. And then on top of that, we also are auditing the apps built within Shopify. So, like the Shopify mobile app or Frenzy on iOS. Basically anything that's produced for mobile, our team takes a look at it and decides, with the help of the team that built it, whether there are any areas that might be vulnerable and how we can work together to make sure those are patched. On top of that, we also have at Shopify a bug bounty program. And so for anybody who hasn't heard that term before, it's basically a way for security researchers, hackers, to find vulnerabilities on our websites, on our applications, as well as a whole bunch of other different companies. And they submit what are called proof of concepts. So it's basically them saying, we found this vulnerability, here's proof that we actually found it. This is why it's bad. We're letting you know about it. And if it's actually a legitimate issue, then we pay them. So we, on our application security team for web and mobile, we also monitor that service, that bug bounty program. And we don't get very many mobile reports because mobile security it's just harder for people to get into. Like, it's a little bit more cost prohibitive and it's not as big a specialty as, say, like web security is right now. But we do get some. And it's our responsibility to basically walk through their proof of concept, decide whether it's legitimate, basically whether they deserve the bounty for that report, and then work with the rest of our AppSec team to decide how much money they should get for it. So those are kind of like the three main areas that we work with. And we work really closely with the Android and iOS teams at Shopify, as well as the web application security teams as well, because there tends to be a lot of overlap between, something that might be happening with, something that happens with the API could affect the mobile application as well as the web application. So that's for Shopify, at least. Other companies may run things a bit differently, but
Do you do that black box, like do you look at the APK, or would you actually look at the source itself?
we do both. I really like reverse engineering things, and Ivan does too. We've talked about this. So we basically get like a black box version of the application from our team, reverse it as if we were just grabbing it from the Google Play Store or something like that, and then from there we go and we look through the actual source code. So it's kind of both sides of the fence, which makes it fun. Great. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, I'll be around.